Hey everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the Polish opening. The Polish opening begins with white playing this move b4. Certainly not a very common opening. Usually white prefers to take some more central space in the opening as opposed to flank space out here on the side of the board. But it's certainly an interesting way to play. It does open a line for this bishop to develop, and it also possibly hints at the idea of pushing this pawn to b5, possibly kicking away the black knight if the black knight shows up here on c6. So let's take a look at how the game can progress here. Black has many ways to handle this. Let's say black plays e5, grabbing some space here in the center, and attacking this b4 pawn. That's also kind of the downside of putting that pawn on b4. It's a bit exposed, but here white doesn't have to defend that pawn. White will usually continue with bishop b2, simply counterattacking the pawn here on e5. Black can defend this pawn. d6 has been played, and even f6 has been played. f6 is a pretty interesting move, actually, simply trying to shut down this bishop's diagonal. Black's not too worried yet about exposing the short diagonal to the king, because the queen can't come to h5 for now, and black leaves this bishop open to still attack this b4 pawn. But the main line continues bishop takes b4 and bishop takes e5. And at first glance, this looks kind of favorable for white, because they've exchanged their flank pawn here, their b pawn, for black's valuable central pawn. And now white has two central pawns compared to black's one, but black is going to probably be able to develop much faster than white. Black has a lot more open lines for the pieces, and this bishop's certainly going to have to move again. The bishop's not going to last long here on e5. Black should play knight to f6 to make sure that this bishop can't take on g7. And now both sides will develop some pieces, for example, knight to f3, knight to c6. White usually wants to preserve this bishop so they can play bishop b2. d5, opening lines for this bishop, and black takes the center for now. White should probably play e3 to open a path for their other bishop to develop. Black can go ahead and castle. And now white can either play a move like bishop e2, just calmly finishing up their development, or white will sometimes play c4 right away and try to strike at the black center here, creating some early pawn tension. White's a bit slow getting developed here. They still have a ways to go, but they're hoping that, especially after these two pawns get exchanged, maybe their central pawn majority can count for something later on, once white finishes development and begins expanding there in the center. It should be mentioned back here on move 2, knight c6 would not be a good choice to defend this pawn because, as we mentioned, b5 is pretty strong. After knight to d4, white can win material here by playing e3, not only attacking this knight but also defending the b5 pawn, and after this knight moves to safety, this e5 pawn will be taken. Not a good choice for black. So that's one possible setup there with e5. Certainly black has other setups as well. For example, black can play d5 here, and now after bishop b2, black can just play knight f6. Now there's no pawn to be taken here on e5, but of course black cannot take the b4 pawn either. White can play e3. Black has many choices here. Black can either play e6 to open this bishop to attack this pawn, or black will sometimes even play bishop f5 first, trying to develop that bishop before playing e6 and committing these pawns to light squares. And now after knight f3, now black can play e6. Now white should probably defend this pawn. White often plays a3 here. White does sometimes try to play c4, just striking back at the center like we mentioned, but it is kind of inconvenient that this pawn is hanging. It might be dangerous for black to take right away, because after bishop takes b4, white could play queen a4 check, forking the bishop and king, and when black plays the forced knight c6 to defend that bishop, now knight to e5, and black's under some pressure here with their knight being attacked twice and being pinned, and that bishop being dependent on the knight. So that might not be a great choice for black. But eventually white is probably going to have to defend this b4 pawn. If white plays c4, black often can just play c6 here, and now they're threatening next turn to take this pawn because there's no more queen a4 fork now because this pawn shuts off that diagonal. Sometimes white can just advance now though and play b5, creating even more pawn tension here on the black position. One rare but interesting line here for black is to play a5 on move 1, simply trying to exchange off white's flank pawn here for black's pawn that's even further from the center, and opening this file for the rook here. White usually won't make that exchange. White will just push that pawn to b5, which is kind of where the pawn wants to be headed anyways. That's probably why a5 is not such a popular choice here, but black can certainly just continue on with their development, play something like knight f6, and it's just interesting that in this position, playing a5 on move 1 can actually be a reasonable move here for black, which is not often the case, of course. Black doesn't really lose any time for his development by playing it because white has to move this pawn again. White wasn't really able to just develop a piece in response to a5. Finally, I just want to show one other setup against the Polish that I found really interesting. I've actually only faced this opening once when I had the black pieces in a tournament, and this is the option I chose against the Polish opening. So b4, black can play d5. Now after bishop b2, we looked at just playing a normal move here like knight to f6, but this move queen d6 is really interesting for black, threatening the b4 pawn, and also supporting the e5 square so black can play e5 and take the whole center. This is another good example of kind of the strangeness of this opening. It's not very often that black can play a move like queen d6 on move 2 and have it be a reasonable move, but here it works out. And there's another point to this move. White usually would like to advance this pawn to b5 when it's attacked, but here b5 doesn't really work because after queen b4, the bishop and pawn are forked. So after queen d6, white will usually just defend this pawn with a3, but now black can implement their plan and play e5 and take the whole center. Of course, it's not the end of the world for white. White can try to pressure that center from afar. White can play knight f3 here, threatening to take on e5. Black can play f6 though, just kind of shutting down this bishop's diagonal and making sure this e5 pawn is solid. But now white's going to play e3 and probably try to play c4, as we've seen in some other lines, just adding some pressure to that big center that black has. After bishop e6, white has played here d4, and if black plays e4, now this knight can just come back, probably to d2, and now white can play c4 and fight against this pawn chain that black's built. And you get a pretty interesting game. Black managed to get a space advantage here out of the opening, but white's going to be able to fight back and grab some space of their own here on the queen side. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com right now. Get signed up there. Only takes a couple seconds, and I'll send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. I'm trying to help more players become masters, hopefully in a fraction of the time it took me. Thanks, and I'll see you there.